Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Many things to get to, not least of which Mr. Enchetti over here found himself in the center.
The middle of a storm.
Totally unintentionally in the middle of an Elon Musk and Washington Post storm. So we will definitely have those details for you. But in addition, the Biden administration now actually contemplating maybe canceling some significant amount of student debt. We'll take you through the arguments for and against and what they are actually thinking. We also have the details on what is a crazy story of potential financial fraud.
This is insane.
Yes,
and
crazy. Some actual, maybe a little bit of Wall Street accountability here. We will see some new developments with Mr. Cawthorn. Speaking of financial fraud, allegations that Congressman Madison Cawthorn is at the center of an insider trading scheme regarding a Let's Go Brandon crypto something.
We'll get into it.
Yeah, it's like a little bit too perfect. And then we also have Bernie Sanders putting a lot of pressure on Biden to use the power of the federal government to say, listen, Amazon, if you are going to illegally union bust, you're not going to get this $10 billion cloud computing contract from the federal government. That's something we've been covering here. The Biden coming in, he promised explicitly that he would do exactly that no federal government contracts would go to companies engaged in illegal union busting. So Bernie calling him out, asking him to actually stick to his campaign promise there. We also have David Dayen on to give us an update on where exactly we are in terms of inflation and the supply chain crisis. So lots to get to this morning, but we do want to start, Saagar, with the very latest from the whole Elon Musk taking over Twitter saga.
That's right. Okay, so we gave you guys all the details of the actual purchase. And basically, I think the story of the last 48 hours is both the freak out of the press, which we will get to, but also how Elon is approaching Twitter, and he's subtweeting both the executives, but also really the product itself. So let's start with the product, and let's put that up there on the screen. So Elon, in one very noticed tweet, said, Truth Social is currently beating Twitter and TikTok on the Apple App Store. Let's go ahead and put his next response up there on the screen, going after Truth Social, specifically saying, Truth Social, terrible name, exists because Twitter censored free speech. He follows up saying it should be called Trumpet instead, which actually is a decent enough name. But the point that he's trying to make there is that this entire extended universe of so-called free speech Twitter alternatives only exists because Twitter did not abide by the principles of free speech. So he's pointing correctly to the fact that Truth Social exists because Trump was booted off of Twitter. The fact that Gab exists also because of mass cancellation. The Parler, I guess, does it still exist? I'm not exactly sure. Anyway, it existed for a period of time of which it was semi-popular. And then I think we have Getter now as well. I know that there's another blockchain one called Minds. That's the only one that actually seemed kind of interesting to me. However,
I've never heard of that one.
The guys were on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I remember listening to it being extraordinarily skeptical. And I said, oh, these guys actually seem interesting because it was a blockchain thing. It's decentralized technology, and also they abide by a true First Amendment censorship type policy. So that's obviously something that I support. However, I think what Elon is getting at is that he wants to neuter, as the new head of the platform, whenever this deal eventually does close, the ability for the Trumps of the world and the Jason Millers of the world over at Getter and others in order to try and grift off of and take off these pieces of the audience. This point that we have tried to make explicitly. The benefit of Twitter is that everybody is on it. The benefit of Facebook is that everybody is on it. The problem is that when you have the lesser network effects on these smaller platforms, they're just not as useful because that's where the true value of the product actually comes from.
They're not as useful, and frankly, they're not as fun.
No, they're not as fun.
Because you always point out, like, what fun is Twitter without being able to own the libs?
Owning the libs is fun.
If the libs aren't there, then you don't get to see them like freak out at whatever your provocation
and the cons
is.
too. The cons freak out all the time. It's fun to see.
Very true. Very true. So you have to have a diverse ideological array of individuals to trigger on any of these social media sites for them to really be interesting and worthwhile. It's funny because especially that, the tweet that he sent of like Truth Social, terrible name, exists because Twitter censored free speech. It sounds like a very Trumpian tweet.
That's true.
Which made me realize that, Elon has really, Trump used to be the king of Twitter. Elon has really supplanted him at this
absolutely.
point. And so even though in certain ways, like obviously it's disproportionately the right end of the political spectrum that's really celebrating this and hoping they bring Trump back and all of these things, this is kind of a mixed bag for Trump himself.
I completely agree.
Because he has these competing interests of, number one, if he's allowed back on the platform, but that will completely kneecap his financial investment here.
Multi-billion-dollar SPAC.
Exactly, at Truth Social. The fact that Elon has kind of one-upped him now in the sort of king of Twitter department, so he doesn't have that same hold over the platform that he once did. So I do think it's kind of a mixed bag for him personally, not to mention, as we've pointed out here many times, I don't know that it was bad for his brand to not be on Twitter and not have his like obnoxious musings in our face every single day. So we'll see how he ultimately handles this. Obviously, they all have to pretend like they like it.
Yes.
They have to pretend like they're happy, that they're really glad that, free speech might return to Twitter. And I think there's a lot of caveats around that and a lot of questions whether that'll actually happen. But they have to pretend like they like it, even though, for many of these people who have been involved with some of these various, alternative free speech platforms, it's going to really financially undercut them and make their products essentially irrelevant.
Yeah, it's what's interesting to me too are also some of the network effects that are taking place right now. So let's put this up there on the screen. A lot of people have been taking notice, which is that conservatives question huge spikes in Twitter followers after the Elon Musk takeover. And there definitely does seem to be something to this, Krystal, which is that you saw large gains by majority conservative accounts. I'm talking like 10, 20,000 extra amounts of followers relative to normal that was pointed out on Social Blade data. So here are some of the biggest swings that we saw in the last 24 hours. Marjorie Taylor Greene gained 41,000 followers. Ted Cruz gained 40,000 followers. Laura Ingraham, 27,000. Joe Biden, 26,000. The Biden one I would put out because whenever you have millions and millions, I don't think that really matters.
Wait, so Biden jumped up?
Apparently Joe Biden jumped up.
Huh.
Newt Gingrich jumped up. However, it says Barack Obama lost 5,000. Again, that's just a general
Newt Gingrich has a great
burn.
Twitter account, by the way. It's lots of pictures of him and Callista
Pure
doing
boomer.
various things. Yeah, I enjoy it actually.
Michelle Obama lost 20,000. Bernie Sanders also lost 19,000. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez lost 12,000. So I think there is something interesting going on, but we don't actually know. So in terms of Elon's response, here's what he says. Let's put this up there, which is that every media outlet on Earth wrote about me acquiring Twitter, causing a massive influx of new users. I don't know if he has any data in order to back that up. I actually have an alternative theory, and I'm curious what you think, which is that what they said is immediately after the sale, Twitter actually went ahead and locked down its core source code and its algorithm. So I'm curious whether there was some sort of daily manipulation or, okay, this sounds more nefarious. More, let's just say, daily curation that was happening by engineers, that by locking it down, just simply changed the way that people are gaining followers. Now, I personally gained about 20,000 followers. I just checked in the last 2 days, but Elon also replied to me, which we'll get to. Yeah, I think that's really, I don't think it has anything to do with that, but I am looking at other accounts who didn't have any of that, and I'm like, oh, yeah.
I think you and even me just being tangentially, related to the Elon Musk replying to you and the whole blow up over that, I also gained followers, but I would put our data aside because we did have a sort of unusual Twitter activity associated with our accounts, but it is strange. I honestly have no idea what to make of it.
I don't really know.
You do have some percentage of liberals who are saying, I'm done with the platform and I'm leaving. I am skeptical, though, that it's in these kind of mass numbers.
I agree with you.
That would be one explanation of why people on the left side of the spectrum lost followers and conservatives tend to gain followers, because you've got now, this is one, sort of organic theory, is you've got all this press about what's going on with Elon and Twitter. So you've got conservatives returning to the site or signing up on the site for the first time. And so that explains those increases in followers. And at the same time, you have liberals abandoning ship and saying, I'm, taking my toys and going home. But I am just a little bit skeptical that there really is that much movement organically in terms of users coming in and users going out. But I don't really have an alternative explanation. I just don't know. It's weird.
Yeah, it is certainly. And look, I think all of this should always be couched in this. Most people are not on Twitter. And I mentioned this, but I went ahead and pulled the data. You guys might have missed this. Snapchat right now is booming. It currently has 115 million more daily active users per day than Twitter. Think about it. In terms of cultural impact, nobody seems to reckon with the fact that the vast majority of people are on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok. Those, in terms of popular culture and the everyday user experience for most people, are what matter. Twitter, though, is for elites. Now, again, why we spend so much time talking about it is it matters because elites run the entire country. They run every institution in American life. So what they think, how they interact, and what they do matters a lot. That's ultimately why, Elon even bought it in the first place, and why we will talk about it in terms of followers and all that, because that obviously matters amongst elite cachet. And we spend time talking and thinking about the policies on that platform because that has a major downstream effect on basically everything that normal people at home are consuming, whether they know it or not. Think about the news business, think about Hollywood and entertainment, and just the most efficient way for celebrities and others in order to communicate with people. A lot of that happens on Twitter in terms of discourse, in terms of exposing to us how a lot of these elites actually think and how they talk to each other. So that is why we are spending such amount of time, even though we know, right now, the vast majority of people who are watching or listening to this, they're not consuming it on Twitter. And even if we did put it out on Twitter, I don't think it would do all that well relative to our YouTube presence, our Spotify, Apple Podcasts, our Instagram channel, our TikTok channel. That's really where people are consuming a lot of this content relative to Twitter itself, even though it does have an obvious downstream impact on people.
It is really interesting too, because one thing that we've realized being in the YouTube space for a number of years at this point is that the YouTube world and the Twitter world are very
totally
different.
Separate. Yeah.
And now that we're, also a podcast, we've also realized that world and what people respond to there is also very different. The great thing about the podcast world is it is much more of a neutral platform. It is much more of an actual, true sort of meritocracy. Now, of course, you have a massive advantage if you come in with some sort of a name builder platform, because it's hard for people to find new things. It's a little more complicated since there isn't that algorithm surfacing for you. Hey, we think you would like this to that same extent. But, I think what the best hope is that there's going to be more transparency on Twitter. I'm excited about the idea of maybe the algorithm would be made transparent. Even though that's not the end-all be-all, at least that provides an opportunity for reporters and experts to dig in and help inform the public about how this is actually happening, what sort of things are being surfaced, what sort of things are being prioritized. And, transparency isn't everything, but it can be a tool for helping garner public support for some sort of changes, or potentially for making the platform even more neutral. So those are the sort of things I'm, hopeful, cautiously hopeful about. But to the point of the story being important, just the question of what happens to Trump's Twitter account is a justifiable huge news story. Because this is a man who continues to be the leader of the Republican Party, very central to our politics, who was one of the, if not the most dominant figure on Twitter for lots of years. So, just the question of what happens to his Twitter account and how he responds to it alone is something that is worth considering in the context of, how our politics move forward and what that all looks like. And, I saw someone making this argument from the left. It may have even been Glenn who was making this argument, but for people who share my, more my political leanings and more left-leaning, you should not be comfortable with the idea that a president who, polite society doesn't like can be just completely banned and vanished from the public square, because you don't think that if a Bernie Sanders type candidate or whoever the next sort of left standard bearer who really is a kind of dissident and challenges some of the established Democratic Party and cultural liberalism establishment, you don't think that there's going to be a similar effort to deplatform and to marginalize and to censor that person? Of course. So don't build the tools that are ultimately going to be weaponized against you.
Absolutely. That's something that we can't emphasize enough. If you challenge power in any way, power will go after you with the means that it has at its disposal, which is why building in safeguards and abiding by first principles are the most important thing that we can have.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.